So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Marilyn Dumont, who I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Dumont is a Cree Metis poet, and some of her poetry does deal with being Metis in this sort of hybrid in-between ethnicity, right? Because the Metis are an ethnic group made up of the descendants of Indigenous people and primarily French fur traders. Not exclusively French, but primarily French fur traders in Canada. And the Metis are their own ethnicity. They have their own distinct culture that blends the two sort of broad backgrounds of primarily like Cree, Ojibwe, different sort of central Canadian tribes, nations, bands, etc., with French influences, settler colonial influences, etc., etc. So it's a hybrid culture, a hybrid ethnicity, and because of that, there is an element of Metis culture that is sort of betwixt and between, right? That it is not that Metis people are neither fully Indigenous nor fully settler colonial. And so they don't necessarily fit into either category. And this is a challenge for many Metis people because it is very isolating, right? And so Dumont has this one poem called Leather and Naugahyde. And it's interesting because one of the things Dumont does is she writes a lot of prose poems. Not exclusively, but I mean, if you look at this, these two pages, we have here 3 prose poems. Circle the Wagons, Leather and Naugahyde, and It Crosses My Mind. And a lot of poets don't really do prose poetry, or don't do very much prose poetry, in part because, interestingly enough, prose poetry is kind of betwixt and between as well, right? The distinguishing line between a piece of prose, fiction, creative, nonfiction, whatever it is, and a piece of poetry is hard to define, right? So what makes something a prose poem as opposed to a piece of prose, which is the form that it uses, is difficult, right? If you just look at a piece of prose poetry, sometimes without the context of being told this is a prose poem, you would be hard-pressed to identify it as such. So it is this hybrid genre. And this poem, this prose poem, Leather and Naugahyde, deals with that sense of being between, and in some senses, not as good as, right? Because this is one problem with hybrid identities, is that they can be figured as neither the one thing nor the other. Neither fully Indigenous with the identity, markers, and pride and heritage that comes with that, nor fully settler colonial with the identity, markers, and pride and heritage that comes with that. So this is Leather and Naugahyde. So I'm having coffee with this treaty guy from up north, and we're laughing at how crazy the Munya are in the city, and the conversation comes around to where I'm from, as it does in underground languages, in the oblique way it does to find out someone's status without actually asking. And knowing this, I say I'm Metis, like it's an apology. And he says, like he forgives me. Like he's got a big heart and mine's pumping diluted blood, and his voice has sounded well fed up to this point, but now it goes thin. like he's across the room taking another look, and when he returns, he's got this look, and that says, he's leather and I'm naga hide. Right, so this is, again, this very distinct conception of self and one's place within the racial hierarchies of a racialized and hierarchized world, right? There is, at this point, I mean, and this was not always necessarily the case, right? For a long time, to be Indigenous was pretty unambiguously to be at the bottom of the social ladder. That's still true in many, many ways in Canada and the United States. But the, say, American Indian movement and things like this, the movements to reestablish Indigenous cultures, Indigenous resurgence, the movements to build Native American, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis pride, etc., have been fairly successful, despite the fact that settler colonialism and capitalism still systematically dispossesses, disenfranchises, represses, etc., Indigenous people. But there is an element of Indigenous pride, and the Métis kind of don't have access to that in the same way, right? There is Métis pride, right? People are proud of being Métis. That is something that is central to many Métis people's identity. But it's also a marker of being impure. And that's quite racially charged language, right? In terms of like ethnic purity, racial purity, all of these things have significantly horrific racialized histories in terms of eugenics and racial superiority ideologies, etc., etc. But it's there. It's also a component of the human experience, unfortunately. And so there's this sort of sense of not being as Indigenous as properly Indigenous people, right? Not being as white as proper white people, right? This sense of being a sort of lesser version of each thing is explored through this poem, and this sort of sense of quality associated with leather versus naga hide, right? That being said, Dumont definitely conceptualizes herself as within the same larger socio-cultural grouping of First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis people, all of whom experience repression and dispossession, cultural violence, and often physical and sexual violence under settler colonial capitalism with its racialized hierarchies, right? And a poem like Helen Betty Osborne really reflects this sense of connectedness that Dumont has. And as a brief bit of background, Betty Osborne was horrifically murdered. She was a young Indigenous woman in, I think, Alberta, and she, I think it was 1986, I want to say. She was kidnapped by a group of 4 white men who took her out into the wilderness, the plains. They beat her, raped her, and stabbed her to death with a screwdriver. It is one of the most horrific and notorious cases of a missing and murdered Indigenous woman. It made international news in a way that the vast majority of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases do not, because Indigenous women and girls still face substantially higher rates of physical violence, sexual violence, murder, kidnapping, disappearance, probably sex trafficking, etc., than the general populations of either Canada or the United States. And so this is definitely still an ongoing issue. And this poem, Helen Betty Osborne, deals with collective memory, the collective experience of Indigenous people within settler colonial systems of violence. So this is Helen Betty Osborne. Betty, if I set out to write this poem about you, it might turn out instead to be about me, or any one of my female relatives. It might turn out to be about this young Native girl growing up in rural Alberta in a town with fewer Indians than ideas about Indians, in a town just south of the Aryan nations. It might turn out to be about Anna Mae Asquith, Donald Marshall, or Richard Cardinal. It might even turn out to be about our grandmothers, beasts of burden in the fur trade, skinning, scraping, pounding, packing, left behind for British standards of womanhood. Left for white melting-skinned women, not bits of brown women, left here in this wilderness, this colony. Betty, if I start to write a poem about you, it might turn out to be about hunting season instead, about open season on Native women. It might turn out to be about your face, young and hopeful, staring back at me, hollow now, from a black and white page. It might be about the townsfolk, gentle word, townsfolk who believed Native girls were easy, and less likely to complain if a sexual proposition led to violence. Betty, if I write this poem. And so again, this is a thing that's very, very much about the Indigenous experience across the board, whether that is for full-blooded Indigenous people, Metis, whatever it is. The rates of violence, rates of sexual violence, the rates of murder, disappearance, etc., are again substantially higher than they are for the average population. It is a socio-cultural system that sees the bodies of Indigenous people as open for exploitation, open for violence, open for the use and exploitation by white people.